Hello, friends, and
Hello.
welcome back to the We Are Trying podcast. My name is B.
And my name is Aurora.
Aurora's taking the lead on this week's.
I am.
I went a little overboard last week. Oh, can I just point out something really quick?
Mhm.
I am wearing the same shirt as last week. I know. I had my first day of work at Starbucks, for those who are watching. And this is what I wore to work because we have a specific color palette to dress with. So,
Oh, do you? That's cool.
I don't want to talk about it. It's been a long day.
Well, today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics. Very, very different from last week's true crime. Maybe a little bit less murder this week, just a little bit. Today we're going to talk about movie musicals. So B, I have a couple of questions for you before I start going on my long random tangents. What is your favorite movie musical?
Oh, geez.
Of
I
any
had it in
era?
my brain. And now it's gone. Okay, this is going to sound really bad, but I actually don't really like the sound of music.
That's fair. That's not bad at all.
I'm
I
just
get that.
not the biggest fan of it. I had it in my brain earlier today because I was like, I feel like I'm going to be asked this, and now it's just not here.
That's okay. I have 2 more questions, so I can go to the other questions and come back to
Yeah.
them. Okay.
Yeah.
Who's your favorite movie musical star?
Ah! Oh, I have my favorite movie musical, but it's going to be, people might hate this, The Last 5 Years.
Really?
Yes, I think they did a really great job with that movie and really setting like the timelines going like this. They did a really good job of setting that, which I think was cool. I don't really have
that.
Yeah, I don't really have a favorite actor.
That's okay. And my last question for you is, when you think of movie musicals, particularly like the epitome stereotypical movie musical, what do you think the reoccurring themes are that we are going to be discussing in length today?
Oh man, I feel like I might get this question wrong.
Probably. It's not going to be what you expect.
Honestly, like the stupid like love trope.
That's
of
fair.
Like bad boy and the good girl, and you know.
So the reoccurring themes are patriotism, capitalism, and sex. I'm a big history nerd, so we do have to look at this historically. I'm so sorry. I have 2 pages here of notes just on the invention of synchronized sound. But I'm going to condense it because it's important to get into here. So, musicals. Musicals, the idea has existed for a very, very long time. We see it in opera and operetta and then musicals. In the early 20th century, musical theater, as we know, didn't really exist. It was mostly revues and vaudeville acts, which worked because you didn't need that through plot. Nobody was really interested in the through plot. They were just interested in the, spectacle, talent, whatever. And in Hollywood, it was about the same. And as we go through, you'll notice that Hollywood and theater tend to follow the exact same, especially American theater, tend to follow the exact same parallel lines in what they do and what they want to do. So Hollywood at the time was very much about like the spectacle of romance and the spectacle of comedy farces, People would pay 5 cents and then go to the theater and they would watch a couple of animated shorts. They would watch newsreels and then they would watch maybe a couple of Charlie Chaplin bits, or they'd watch like a movie, which were like 90 minutes long at max. And if there was any music involved, it was actually all played by an orchestra in the movie theater, which is really cool too. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And this was the case up until the early 1920s, when in came this man named Lee DeForest, who was very funny. He was an inventor, a pioneer in radio, and he had over 180 patents and also lost most of them. He created something called phonofilm in 1919, which was the first way to synchronize sound with film. And he tried to sell it off to Hollywood, but Hollywood was like, no, we've got it. We're fine. We don't need We don't need your sound. You know, it was this like coded language that people just understood when they went to go see these films. So they didn't need to change anything. It worked, you know? And he established DeForest Phonofilm Company and tried to create films and get the attention of Hollywood, and they would not look at him. So the only place he could show off his stuff was in underground experimental theaters. Yeah. So the idea of sound and synchronized sound in film was taboo and underground at first. And he did a lot of films that were specifically just the filming of vaudeville acts and musical acts and political speeches. So most of the early stuff of like synchronized film sound was like politicians and vaudeville stars, which is very cool too.
Sorry, yeah. I shouldn't have laughed at that.
No, it's very funny. It's very funny. But this company, DeForest Phonofilm, ended up going bankrupt in 1926 because Hollywood didn't care and he had nothing to do. And at the same time, his methods were being seen by other filmmakers who were stealing them, people like Max and Dave Fleischer. And then, in and around the time of the collapse of his company, his collaborators, Freeman Harrison Owens and Theodore Case, decided to leave DeForest because of ignorance and arguments and misuse, and took his idea with them and went straight to the Fox Film Corporation. And
this poor man.
Right? William Fox looked them dead in the eyes and went, "I will pay for your patent." So Fox Films was the first company to create a patent and create their own synchronized sound film camera called Fox Movietone. And it was all taken from Lee DeForest. So we have the Lee DeForest to thank. And William Fox was like, yes, we'll do this. This will work. We'll figure out a way to make this work. You know, people love music. Why not? As soon as everybody started catching wind of this, everybody started to go, oh, okay, well, if Fox is doing it, then we need to hop on the band. So then Warner Brothers produced Vitaphone, and there were all these other companies jumping on the bandwagon. Despite all this, he ran out of money, couldn't really do too much, and all the big corporations were now basically stealing his stuff. But he couldn't do much about it. You know, the people who they got the information from had worked with him, so it was their information as well, you know? So that's sort of the introduction of synchronized sound and how it came to be. Just in case you wanted to know. The very first film to feature synchronized sound was The Jazz Singer. And that's a very well-known fact. Everybody knows about The Jazz Singer. It was released in 1927, coincidentally, the same year that Showboat premiered on Broadway. Remember when I said they run at parallels? In the same year that Broadway went, we need to create cohesive stories. Hollywood went, we need to create cohesive stories. Interesting, yes. So it was, while it wasn't a full, complete, talked through film, they did get the vaudeville star Al Jolson to be in it, who was best known for his blackface character. And he did play his blackface character in this film. So don't go watch the film. Don't support the film. Support support like the wonderful technological advances it made. Don't support Al Jolson. Anyway, this was the first film to ever include both non-diegetic and diegetic music. And a lot of it as well was songs that he was famous for performing, songs like My Mammy and stuff. So there wasn't supposed to be a lot of dialogue in the film, just like enough music that people could be like, whoa, sound on film, so cool, you know. But Al Jolson started improvising during one of the takes, saying things like his infamous motto, wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet, and other things. And the producers and director were like, oh, that's really cool. And introduced more and more dialogue into the film. And people were like, wow, this is so cool. So when the film was released, people were very, very skeptical. And at the premiere, all the big silent film stars went. And there's this great quote from this historian named Scott Iman. He said, as the film ended and applause grew with the house lights, Sam Goldwyn's wife, Frances, looked around at the celebrities in the crowd. She saw terror in all their faces, she said, as if they knew that the game they'd been playing for years was finally over. Mm-hmm.
Period. Full stop. Period. Right there.
So another just like little tidbit in case you didn't pick up on this is that the very first synchronized sound film was also a musical to an extent, not like a musical that we know, but the very first synchronized film was musical. And this was quickly followed by another Jolson vehicle called The Singing Fool in 1928, which is actually one of the films that is heavily parodied in the later movie musical classic Singing in the Rain.
I'm learning so much
already, right? This is one of my favorite topics. But the success of The Singing Fool is what propelled everybody in Hollywood to start putting sound equipment into their theaters. At the time as well, the production companies owned the theaters. So production companies would only show their own movies in their own theaters. So as soon as the production companies started producing sound in their pieces, the theaters had to upgrade because they were only producing those pieces. And then with the introduction of Al Jolson and this vaudeville music theater sound, everybody was suddenly scrambling to get Broadway composers to write for their films. It's also important to note that at this time, the hits, like the hits that you heard on the radio, were Broadway songs. They were all coming from people like Cole Porter and Irving Berlin and the star composers of Tin Pan Alley. So of course, Hollywood is like, well, those are the star songs. Those are what people care about. We need to get those in our movies. Thus, how people started to be drawn to these talkie films because they recognized the songs. So it all started with musicals. So between 1929 and 1930, Hollywood produced over 100 movie musicals. I like to call, this is not the official title, but I like to call this the penny novel era. Penny novels, I don't know, do you know what a penny novel is?
Kind of, not really.
Okay, so penny novels were like books that you could buy back in like the 1800s. I think they had them into the 1900s as well. And they were just, you bought them for a penny, and they were just a collection of like random stories, comics, whatever. It's actually where Sweeney Todd, the story, first appeared. It was in a penny novel, a penny dreadful. But they were just like, they churned them out really, really quick. They were cheap, they were done, but they were entertaining. That's what I consider these movies. There's no substance to them. They were just churned out with like a formula, but people loved them because they were big and bright and brassy. And most of this was like the vaudeville stars coming out as well and like making a big name for themselves. However, by 1932, the market was so saturated, people didn't really want to go see the movie musicals anymore. So it went up and down very, very, very quickly. I do want to take a quick little side tangent here. It's important to also recognize Walt Disney at this point. So Walt Disney, known as an animator, but was also a massive innovator in film. And he was always setting out to further improve upon what was already a thing. So he was well known for his animated shorts at the time. People loved flocking to the theaters to see Mickey Mouse shorts. And then he did things like the Silly Symphonies and such. Like he was a big name suddenly in the late 20s and early 30s. When The Jazz Singer came out, Walt Disney went, I wonder if there's a way to synchronize sound to cartoons. And he was able to figure it out in less than a year and immediately produced Steamboat Willie. This man was able to figure out how
Disney.
Right? It's also important to note that this draw to sound is what got him in connection with Jimmy McDonald in the mid-30s. And the two of them would go on, specifically Jimmy, but with Walt's guidance as well, went on to create one of the first sound machines, which has been used in over 139 films and 335 shorts with 28,000 sound effects and is still used today.
Quick question. Yes. Do you think Walt Disney's head is frozen in, what is it, the Pirates of the Caribbean ride? Do you believe that?
I can confirm for you it is not.
What?
I have been
How can you confirm?
I have been on both Pirates of the Caribbean rides multiple times.
Isn't it dark?
It is. I've also spoken.
So how can you see?
I've spoken to people who work there and they all go, I can confirm for you, there were no human beings on this ride.
But they would not say that it's actually true, right? Because they work there. And if there's actually dead bodies in there, people aren't going to want to go to Disney World. I mean, I would. Because I'd be like, I want to see it. Cue last week's episode, me saying I want to watch people get beamed up into, I want to see Walt Disney's frozen head.
Well, here's the thing. If you go to, I can't remember I think it's California, there are actual bones on the ride. Like there's an actual skull above.
Human? Real human?
An actual human skull, on the ride.
What?
We have to go together so I can point it out to you because it's small, but there is actually one real human skull.
Is it a childhood?
What?
Is it a child's skull?
No. I just mean it's small because it's like it's not in the forefront of the picture.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, wait, like how small? Like, is it a baby?
It's hung up somewhere.
Sorry, that totally got sidetracked.
I don't even have the same skull, but important, it's there. So, back to movie musicals. And we'll start focusing now specifically on movie musicals and not synchronized sound. So, the 1930s. Do you know who Busby Berkeley is?
The name's familiar, but I can't
okay,
distinctively remember.
So Busby Berkeley is one of the most iconic dance directors of the 1930s. Dance director was often what they would call a choreographer back in the olden days, because choreographer wasn't a word, basically, and because they directed dances, you know? So Busby Berkeley actually started his career as a field artillery lieutenant in World War I and drilled thousands and thousands of soldiers, which would go on to inspire his style of choreography. He was well known in the 1920s as a Broadway dance director for shows like A Connecticut Yankee and Sweet and Low, and then would go on to work in film. His sort of niche was finding a way to transcend theater. So a lot of the films, in the 20s and 30s were about show business, you know? So what he liked to do was start something in a theater and then find a way for it to transition into something else, something that you could never actually see on stage. He's the one who is well known for doing the shots looking down at all the girls making a pyramid staring up. His brand was playing with geometric and kaleidoscope patterns. He was less concerned about your dance ability and more concerned if you could take those directions. So a lot of his dancers weren't necessarily like the most trained dancers. And also a fun fact, he usually wouldn't watch the full film before he started choreographing. He would just be like, this is the song I'm doing, great. So like they never made any sense. But after about 1935, I believe, 1936, something like that, he kind of started to stop choreographing. So a lot of instances in film where they're filmed like that, looking down or with these crazy shapes, are just mimics of him. But one of his most well-known pieces is Remember My Forgotten Man from The Gold Diggers of 1933 and 42nd Street.
Really?
Yes. 42nd Street sort of solidified the idea of showbiz films, showbiz musicals. All the cliches for a showbiz musical, every single one, come from 42nd Street. That director who just really wants a hit, the egotistical star who hurts herself, and the young ingenue has to go in and becomes this huge hit. They all come from 42nd Street, even though 42nd Street only had 4 songs in it. So basically what I'm establishing here is the building blocks of the future.
The future.
The future. So in and around the 30s was the Great Depression. So people didn't have a lot of money. And people going to see films was actually cut down by a third. People just couldn't afford it as much anymore. Plus, people were turning to radio more because it was in their homes and just a little bit more accessible. So musicals were dwindling a bit. And people weren't really as interested in going to see like the dramas. So everything that was being created was escapism. Everything that was being created was this larger than life, sugar-coated thing, which is sort of what established what we know of as your classic movie musical. Like if you think of like, oh, a movie musical, you're probably thinking of like that sequence near the end of Singing in the Rain that's like so out of context. That is a direct result of the Great Depression. See what I meant? It runs with history. And at the same time, Broadway was doing the same thing. You saw composers like Rodgers and Hart stepping up and creating fun shows. And Rodgers and Hart were actually then brought over to Hollywood because of their innovative approach to musical comedy and started making films like Love Me Tonight, which was considered a masterpiece because of the song Isn't It Romantic and how it used time and motifs to tell its story. And that film was actually one of the first to use all of its songs to propel the story and characters. Interesting that it coincides with that evolution happening over in New York. Just a little bit. Just interesting.
Just a little bit.
Slightly.
Just a little bit.
Yeah. Rodgers and Hart also were commissioned to write star vehicles for Al Jolson in a film called Hallelujah, I'm a Bum, where he plays a hobo and then has to change himself for a girl. So basically Grease.
Grease.
Grease is the word. And a piece for George M. Cohan. George M. Cohan doesn't really get a lot of credit in movie musicals because he was mostly a vaudeville man and an early musical theater man, but very, very important to the evolution of musical theater. So seeing him transition into Hollywood, into movie musicals is really awesome, but it didn't last for very long, unfortunately. If you want more about George M. Cohan, just ask me. I got tons. But by 1935, Rodgers and Hart left Hollywood because that's not what they wanted to do and because they weren't being treated great. Okay, so here's where we get into the good stuff. In comes the Production Code of 1930. This, you're going to love this. You ready? This was created by a man who was very proudly anti-Semitic and homophobic.
Basically, end of podcast. End of great. We're going to end this whole podcast. No more episode. I'm kidding.
Basically, the entire point of the Production Code was to stop people like Mae West. The Production Code is another major reason why movie musicals exist, which sounds bizarre, but again, I will get to it. Basically, what it said was you could not be overtly sexual. Women had to be covered completely. There could be no plot devices that revolved around infidelity or sex in any way. And priests and nuns were not allowed to be shown in a bad light, basically. Which meant a lot of, the jokes and stuff that were used in these early films couldn't be used anymore. Which is actually the reason, transition, why we have Fred and Ginger. Everything connects. Everything connects.
Everything's making so much sense.
You know who Fred and Ginger are, of course.
Yeah, of course.
I love Top Hat.
I love Top Hat.
I love Top Hat.
Nobody's gonna get this unless
watch
they
the Love You Make.
The Love You Make.
So you know who Fred Astaire is. Fred Astaire is one of the most affluent stars of the 30s and 40s. Yeah. So he had a sister. Her name was Adele. And they were actually big
rolling in the deep.
Right? She was born in the 1800s and then froze herself and then came back to life in the mid 2000s and started releasing pop songs.
Walt Disney.
She works with Walt Disney. So anyway,
it all comes back to Walt.
Comes back to Walt Disney, and it does. So Fred Astaire, one of the most affluent stars at the time, he started off as a vaudeville star with his sister. They would tour when they were actually like kids, like tiny kids. They would tour and do shows and everything, and they were well loved. And then he went on to be choreographer on Broadway. And he was cast in this very, very small role in this film called Flying Down to Rio. He was just supposed to be playing a band leader who didn't really appear in much of the film. But they went, okay, you're going to dance. We want you to pick from this line of girls who you'd like to dance with. So he goes down the line. He's like, okay, I worked with some of these people. And he sees Ginger. And he goes, oh, I've worked with Ginger before. She's really good. Okay, I'll pick Ginger because I know her and I know we can work together. Well, didn't they win over the film? They were the best part of that film. The film itself was terrible. They were the best parts of the film. And suddenly everybody was like, they have something. They have some kind of spark together that I can't quite pinpoint. You want to know what that spark was? Sexual undertones. The studio gave them a film called The Gay Divorcee. Okay, so Gay Divorcee started their traditional formula of he's a charming playboy and she's the sweet girl and they dance and fall in love. They were just like us. They were believable human beings and they had this connection and people flocked to the theaters to see them because they were musical. They were beautiful when they danced and there was something about them. Something about them being cheek to cheek, the song in Top Hat. Cheek to cheek, dancing cheek to cheek, literally is sex.
I love Top Hat.
Right? And they're sweeping across the floor and talking about dancing cheek to cheek, and they're just talking about sex. And they are considered icons to this day. Their final piece together was The Berkeleys of Broadway in 1949 from MGM, after Judy Garland dropped out because she was being abused by the system. We're not going to get into that, but that's there. If you ever want that story, let me know. So the goal at this time of Hollywood was to find the stars and then create films to showcase them. So it wasn't really about, here's a great idea for a story. It was this person's talented. Let's make a film around them. So the films usually didn't really have much substance or plot. It was just, Bing Crosby sounds nice when he sings.
Just look at this one person.
Literally.
Just look at him.
Literally. Bing Crosby was hired by Paramount in the 30s and was doing films like Pennies from Heaven that were literally just about him singing. That's it. There was no other substance. Mae West was massive in the 30s as a comedian and a crooner, and then had to leave Hollywood because the production code was so strict she couldn't do anything. And then you have Shirley Temple, who was the 30s version of JoJo Siwa. I'm not even kidding.
That's it. That's the best explanation of her I've ever heard. Wait,
Well, it's true. She was on lunchboxes. You could like buy posters of her. Like she was a big deal.
And the hair, like this.
Yeah, and the curly hair. Yeah, yeah.
Guys, JoJo Siwa is just a reincarnated
Shirley Temple. The other really important thing to know about Shirley Temple is that Shirley Temple was about 6 when she rose to stardom. And she did a lot of, again, just like random quick make films. That because she was cute and could sing, worked and could dance. But it was her dancing that really brought her to stardom, especially when she would dance with Bill Bojangles Robinson. They're so adorable together. He's a fully grown adult and she's the 6-year-old child, and they tap dance together. And they were actually the first interracial pairing to succeed in commercial film, which I also love to hear. Other stars at the time included Eleanor Powell, Judy Garland, and Mickey Rooney. Not going to get too far into Judy and Mickey because that's an entire other podcast. They have so many cool stories. But basically, he was doing the Andy Hardy stories. He did one Andy Hardy movie. People in small towns were like, hey, we really like these characters. They're relatable. We want more of these. And the studio went, you like this? Here's 14 more. So they produced 14 films about Andy Hardy and his friend, his school chum, played by Lil Miss Judy Garland. And that thus began the train of Judy and Mickey stories, and thus began the train of let's put on a show films that had that vigor of the 30s films. And again, everything the 30s stands for.
This week's episode is sponsored by Lavender Gemini Shop on Instagram. Please buy from my shop.
Please. Also, if you'd like to say hi to us or ask us any questions, our message link is in our Instagram bios. You can go say, hey, you can go say, Aurora, that was far too much history all at once. I'm brain dead. Or you could like request more from us, less from us, whatever you want. We're there. Just make it PG.
Request a topic you'd like us to cover.
Request a topic. Yeah, that's a better way to say it. And then you get into the 40s with World War II. This is also around the time that Broadway began to shift with Oklahoma and the shift towards like real strong plots. A lot of the stars were going overseas to fight. And this is when Hollywood started to take a patriotic turn. Here we go. Suddenly, every single film is about soldiers or about rah-rah America.
Yeah.
They hired Broadway composers like Jerome Kern, Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hammerstein, and Fields and Warren. And basically, they were bringing them over to create more made-for-film musicals. All of the shows that they were doing were made for film. All from the time movie musicals began to the 40s. They were all just made for film. One of the most notable, and I say this is the most notable because I really like this one, is Yankee Doodle Dandy, which is about George M. Cohan and starred James Cagney. Despite it being overtly patriotic, it's actually quite good, but does cut out a lot of the controversial aspects of Cohan's life. But I do highly recommend Yankee Doodle Dandy for a little escapism. But the big takeaway here is that movie musicals and straight films followed the exact same trajectory as musical theater. They echo what America needs most. America specifically, because rah-rah America. So we saw
rah-rah America.
So we saw Doris Day, the epitome of the perfect housewife. I love Doris Day. We saw Danny Kaye, who is like quirky and silly and a big star. Bing Crosby was he was the top box office star for 5 consecutive years in the 40s.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, we saw Rosemary Clooney. We saw films like Holiday Inn that were about like what soldiers do when they get back from war, you know? And there's like
people.
Pardon?
They fuck people. That's literally what soldiers would do.
Yeah, you're right. So a lot of the stars were also being sent, as well as doing all these patriotic movies and stuff, were also being sent to entertain troops. If you've ever seen The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, there's a really, really great scene in season 3, I think the first episode of season 3, where she's like doing a show for the troops and the troops are getting so rowdy. And I'm like, oh, I feel so bad for you. Could you imagine Bing Crosby trying to sing Swinging on a Star while like soldiers hoot and holler? I cannot imagine. You also had other stars like Ann Miller, who is one of the greatest tap dancers of all time. Have you ever seen Ann Miller's work?
I think so.
Have you seen the movie Kiss Me Kate? Yeah, she's Lois in that. She's beautiful. She's perfect. She's amazing. I love her.
Kiss Me Kate.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites. She worked for the company Columbia. Columbia at the time was known as the cheap production house. You only did something with Columbia if you were struggling, basically, was the idea. So she did this film called CoverGirl, which was supposed to be a Rita Hayworth vehicle. But she, Ann Miller, was the standout. Her and this other actor, I don't know, maybe you know his name. His name was Gene Kelly.
Maybe you know him.
Maybe you know his name. Gene Kelly ended up going on to do a lot more than just be in movie musicals. He went on to revolutionize how movie musicals were created in the 50s with the Freed Unit. Freed Unit was not an actual thing, but so at the time in Hollywood, you were signed by contract to a specific production company. So you'd be signed to a contract for a certain amount of years or a certain amount of films. And if other companies wanted you, they'd have to like write to the other company or call them up and be like, hi, can we borrow so-and-so? Gene Kelly got borrowed from MGM by Columbia to do CoverGirl. And when he blew up, MGM refused to ever loan him out to anyone else ever again.
Smart move.
Yeah. And with MGM, he was part of this thing called the Freed Unit. Again, not really an actual thing. It was mostly just the big creatives at MGM who worked together to create things. And it included Gene Kelly, Stanley Donen, Arthur Freed, who was a songwriter. Occasionally, it would include Comden and Green, Alan J. Lerner, or Fred Astaire as well. It's important to note, though, around this same time, one of the first Broadway-style musicals that was made specifically for film, by Rodgers and Hammerstein, that is, was produced called State Fair. It was so patriotic it hurts. I do not like State Fair. I do not know a single person who likes State Fair, but it has songs like Grand Night for Singing and became this huge, massive hit. What made it different was that it was one of the first movie musicals to not star a blonde. This idea of blondes being beauty and brunettes being evil or whatever came from movie musicals. And State Fair was the first one that was like, no, we will only cast brunettes. Yeah. But the success of this film is what led to Rodgers and Hammerstein letting Fox film all of their Broadway shows from then on. So thanks to State Fair, we had The Sound of Music. Fun fact.
Even though I don't really like The Sound of Music.
No, my grandmother likes The Sound of Music, and that's it. That's the only person.
I know other people who do.
Yeah.
But
I know a lot of people who like The Sound of Music. I enjoy it in short bursts.
Yeah.
So anyway, MGM, back to MGM. They were the epitome of movie musical production company. They had the Freed Unit, they had Gene Kelly, and they had Miss Judy Garland. Judy was the top musical film star of the 40s. She did 16 MGM musicals in the 1940s. Over 10 years, she did 16 musicals and 14 straight films. She did films like Meet Me in St. Louis, which is a classic, very wholesome, very nostalgic, very patriotic wartime film. Oh, it's so patriotic. It burns my teeth. But so sweet. And it had songs like Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas and the Trolley Song, and was directed by her future husband, Vincent Minnelli. That film is just important because it's become like this landmark of what could be done in a movie musical film. It was massive. And she did films like The Pirate, which again starred Gene Kelly. She did Easter Parade, which starred Fred Astaire and is also one of my favorites. And then she would go on in the year 1950, to do the musical Summer Stock with Gene Kelly, which was the film that featured her iconic song Get Happy, where she's wearing like the black fedora and the coat and like comes down the stairs. But that was also kind of the end of Judy Garland as a star. Because of the abuse of the production companies and of her people around her, she was deemed as hard to work with and unreasonable, and MGM put her on probation, and then she got into some more trouble and they ended up firing her. So then she was completely out of the MGM system.
Out.
Yep.
Into your mouth.
Well, maybe not for her. Maybe she can not drink. That would be nice. But this led to Gene Kelly blowing up. Gene Kelly starred in films like Anchors Away and Ziegfeld Follies, and he went on to star in and choreograph an adaptation of the Broadway musical On the Town. So On the Town was not the first, but was probably one of the most notable, almost accurate adaptations of a Broadway musical. At the time, if they were ever adapting, they were changing completely. They were like taking the original title and taking like a little bit of the plot and maybe a couple of the songs and completely rearranging everything else so that it fit their stars, basically. On the Town, they were very close to. And this is also around the time that the Free Unit blew up and Gene Kelly went, why is it so difficult to film dance? Why you can't, and he realized you cannot film dance the same way you film acting. You can film close-ups of actors, but if you film a close-up of a dancer, you miss half of the dance. So what he really put to work was finding new shots that you could use to film musical numbers. And you can see that progression over his career if you watch his early stuff and see, when he wasn't really in charge. And then you watch Singing in the Rain and you see how the cinematography changed, or even An American in Paris, that one in particular. If you watch how he specifically positions the camera and moves with the dancer, and how he finds ways to fill the whole screen with everybody, like the ways that he positions the camera and the tricks that he learns as a dancer to make synchronized sound work and make the visual work, he completely revolutionized movie musicals and how they were made. So, like, how to capture tap sounds, how to, like, the Singing in the Rain scene would not have been as iconic as it was were it not for his directing. As much as it's like this iconic, beautiful song, great dancing, it would not have been what it is without his direction and filming. And neither would pretty much any of the musicals that we know and love today. There you go.
Damn, I'm learning so much right now. I feel like should I get a note? Should I type out some notes?
If you want.
I'm not going to.
I do want to quickly also just give like little shout outs to two of my favorite MGM stars who never get enough attention, which is Russ Tamblyn and June Allison. I love them. If you ever get a chance, look up their stuff. Russ Tamblyn is an incredible acrobat who accidentally became a dancer. He was the youngest brother in Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, and they were like, can you dance? And he went, do you mind if I do a couple flips instead? And they were like, yeah, fine. And June Allison.
Like me auditioning for a musical. I auditioned for a musical because I wanted to just be a dancer, and then I accidentally ended up a singer. And now here I am, many years later.
Here you are.
A singer.
Once we get into the 1950s, movies start to die out a lot with the rise in television and in rock and roll. You have films like Singing in the Rain, which wins the Oscar in the early 50s, which parodied talkies but really stuck to that early showbiz structure. But because people weren't as interested, they wanted to watch TV, a lot of the employees at these production companies were let go, not just producers and writers and techs, but also the stars. And this is sort of how this loaning system and the contracts were crumbled. So no longer would somebody sign on to a company to do 10 films or 10 years of films. They would be hired per production. It saved them money, whatever. What this meant, though, was that they couldn't churn out all the movie musicals they were anymore because they didn't have like the staffed writers who could do that. So moving forward, without the teams, if they wanted to produce a musical, they would have to adapt. So this is where we get Brigadoon, which was actually quite well done.
Brigadoon.
I love Brigadoon. You get Little Abner, which was terrible. The film is so bad. It's so cheap and terrible to watch. But you also get Fox finally starting to produce the R&H work. You get Oklahoma, Carousel King, and I South Pacific, which were all really, really well received, shockingly. But as you can see, there's already so few movie musicals. So it's not as saturated. So going to see a movie musical is more of a big deal at this time. You also get Doris Day stepping up into musicals in the 50s with The Pajama Game and Calamity Jane, which is one of my favorites. I love Calamity Jane so much. And I also just want to give a quick shout out to the musical Hit the Deck, which came out in 1955. And I actually saw somebody say that this might be one of the last great MGM musicals. And I do kind of agree. It starred Ann Miller, Russ Tamblyn, Jane Powell, and Debbie Reynolds, kind of similar to On the Town, but just like this big only could be done in Hollywood MGM style musical. And the end number, Sing Hallelujah, oh, iconic, iconic. And it was kind of the end of this reign of movie musicals, was this hit the deck. After that, TV really just took over, unfortunately. But throughout the 50s, you did have Kiss Me Kate, which was choreographed by the great Bob Fosse. You had High Society, which was not good. And you also had 4 movies that are considered the best movie musical of all time. There's 4 of them.
For those who aren't watching, there are quotations happening.
They're An American in Paris, which is a Gene Kelly Freed Unit film, which, you know, experiments with dance and experiments with visuals and experiments with all this other wonderful stuff. You get Singing in the Rain, which again revolutionizes dance on camera thanks to the Freed Unit and Gene Kelly. You get The Bandwagon, which these days nobody cares about. And you get Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, which is one of my favorite musicals as well. And it was the only one of these 4 that had a completely original score. And it starred Howard Keel and Jane Powell and Russ Tamblyn and a myriad of other people. And I love that one. It's very misogynistic and very pro-patriarchy, but I really like it. And then you get into the 60s when suddenly rock and roll is everything. Elvis pops onto the scene and does 30 musicals over the course of 15 years. 30 random movie musicals, most of them taking place on a beach somewhere, and he like swings his hips and finds a girl and
as he should.
The 60s was also the rise of just like the beach culture, the beach teen. It was around this time that a teenager came to be a thing. Teenagers weren't really a thing before then, like they existed, but the term teenager and the teenage lifestyle really came to be a thing in the late 50s and early 60s. So the teenagers were going to see Elvis movies. Meanwhile, the Hollywood and Broadway producers are like, no. The only way we know how to make money, is this one formula that worked in the 40s. But because they were trying to get people to come see these musicals, they were putting so much more money into securing rights for musicals for these films, and often would try to secure the rights for the musicals before they'd even premiered on Broadway. Yeah.
What?
Right? They were putting so much money into the sets and the costumes and all the effects. These movie musicals were bigger than ever before, and most flopped. So you had like Bells Are Ringing, which, does anybody remember that movie? No one remembers that movie. You have The Music Man, which I genuinely enjoy the original Music Man film, not the remake, the original Music Man film.
Rip.
My Fair Lady, which has its own amounts of controversy behind it. Like Rex Harrison was a nightmare to work with, and they cheated Audrey Hepburn, but like it's fine. That's another story. And then you have Funny Girl, which, you know,
Funny Girl. Wait. Oh, I love Funny Girl.
I love Funny Girl.
I love Funny Girl.
I love that show so much. It's such a wonderful show.
Funny Girl is my favorite movie musical. I think Funny Girl might be my favorite movie musical.
Yes.
Funny Girl as like an older one, and then a newer one is the last 5 years.
Yeah. Funny Girl was not special too much aside from Barbra Streisand.
I love Barbra Streisand. I could listen to Barbra Streisand sing forever.
If it hadn't been for Babs, that movie probably wouldn't have happened in the first place. My favorite song is Cornet Man, just side note. I friggin' love that song. I tried to sing it in one of the classes at school, and I was told I could not. And I went, why? And then I tried to sing it again in my 3rd year, and I was told I could not. And I went, why? But it's because everybody wants to be Fanny Bryce.
I want to be Fanny Bryce.
We'll fight. You know what? We'll do what they did with The Little Wolves, which starred Laura Linney and I forget her face. They just swapped the main character every night. We could do that.
Let's do that.
Okay. You also get Oliver, which ended up winning the Oscar for Best Film in the late 60s. And you get West Side Story and Sound of Music. Side note about West Side Story is it was not a massive flop on Broadway, but not well received. People didn't like it in New York. The songs were actually called unhummable when it premiered.
I could see also why people wouldn't like it, because racism.
Yeah, exactly. And racism of immigrants was on the rise in the 60s.
Yeah.
Love that. But it's a great film. That's one of the really, really good. And then you get The Sound of Music, which takes all this money one step forward, hires this woman who has now won an Oscar for Mary Poppins, Judy Garland, hires Julie Andrews.
Wait. We're going back up there for a second.
Can you imagine Judy Garland
suddenly is just, you're like, yeah, Judy Garland, this was the end of her reign. Suddenly, Judy Garland is now in The Sound of Music. Imagine, though.
No, what Judy Garland was doing in the 60s, we will not get into. It was not The Sound of Music. But that movie took the production value even further and flew the entire cast out to Austria and filmed in Austria. So whoops.
For what reason?
Because they had the money. Because they really wanted to. Because Hollywood went, we know one way, and that one way is classic musicals. Please look at us. And they looked at Sound of Music, and it did pretty well. And Julie Andrews became this huge, massive star. Movie musicals that didn't work in the 60s. I have a list here. I'm just going to name a couple of them. Half a Sixpence.
Never heard of it.
Yep, exactly. Finian's Rainbow. I love that musical. The movie did not work very well. It's so racist. It's so racist.
The musical is like, yeah, cool. Never seen the movie. Never knew there was a movie.
You should watch the movie just because I want to get your reaction. There's a subplot where they turn a white Southern senator black using magic. They make him a black man, and it is all done with blackface. And I just would like to get your reaction. They're also like growing tobacco. Like one of the subplots is that they're growing illegal tobacco. So, you know. Anyway, other musicals that didn't work: Camelot, Paint Your Wagon, and Hello, Dolly.
Really? There's a Hello, Dolly movie. Wait.
Yes, there is. Gene Kelly directed it in the late 60s, and it starred Barbra Streisand as Dolly Levi Gallagher. And the big issue with the film was that Gene was filming it how you would film a big MGM musical. And now with like actual on locations, it didn't quite work the same. And also, Barbra Streisand was like 25 playing a middle-aged woman, which doesn't quite work.
That checks out. I think that map checks out though.
Yeah. So all of this falls apart, and movie musicals are pretty much a thing of the past at this point, save for into the 70s. You get Fiddler and Cabaret and JCS and everything.
I love Cabaret. Gonna say that right now.
I want to play Sally Bowles more than anything else in this world.
Same.
One of our vocal teachers, I'll tell you who later. One of our vocal teachers looked me dead in the eyes. One time she was like, "What character do you want to play?" And I went, "I would love to play Sally Bowles." And she looked me dead in the eyes and went, "You would be the best Sally Bowles." And I went, I am aware. So the 70s really also, they were finally like, oh, people like rock and roll now. Oh, they got it 2 decades late. But we start getting theater, and around the same time, theater and Hollywood going, oh, rock and roll, gotcha. And we get Rocky Horror and Grease. Rocky Horror was so hated. Grease was so loved. You also somehow get Tommy snuck in there. I don't know if you've ever seen Tommy. Love that one. It's so experimental. It's hilarious. You get Sgt. Pepper's and you get The Rose. Do not watch The Rose. I cannot stand The Rose. People love The Rose.
So Rocky Horror, Grease came out of Grease did better than Rocky. Now, which one do you prefer?
Rocky.
Yeah, Rocky.
Look, Grease is terrible. Grease 2 is the greatest thing to ever exist.
I've never seen Grease 2.
It's terrible.
I hated Grease.
No, Grease 2 is so bad. It's so bad. Like, it doesn't even feel like the same film. It's so bad. I will watch Grease 2 until the cows come home. I can quote that film. It's so bad. It's like my Showgirls. Like, Grease 2 is all I care about. Have I ever said something like, let's do it for our country, or Rockahula Luau, or let's bowl tonight? Those are all direct quotes from that movie. One of my favorite quotes from Grease 2 that I never get to use, but every time I listen, there's a song called Who's That Guy in Grease 2, and the main character, who's supposed to be the Sandy of the film, his name is Michael. He's Sandy's cousin. He learns how to ride a motorcycle to impress the Danny of the film, played by Michelle Pfeiffer. And he's riding around the bowling alley parking lot on a motorcycle, scaring away these other like people on motorcycles. And everyone is standing around going, oh my God, who's that guy? Who's that guy? And everyone's like singing this song that's like, ooh, who's that guy? And my favorite line from Grease 2 is him in his thick British accent out loud goes, what would they say if they knew it was Michael? And it's so silly and it's so stupid because he's literally riding right past them and says this out loud. He gives them every single clue, his accent, his name. And it makes me laugh so hard every single time. That was a sidetrack, but it was an important sidetrack just to talk about that one line from Grease 2. Anyway, my favorite film. The 70s also had the release of The Wiz, which was just bad.
The idea of The Wiz.
Great.
Amazing. And I think it could be like, I could talk about The Wiz forever.
They ruined the pacing of the movie, was the big issue. Mm-hmm. And they relied too heavily on stars. Mm-hmm. And they also tried to create the movie adaptation of Hair in the 70s, the late 70s. So the hippies were pretty much gone. The war was over. People were like, I don't care anymore. Nobody cared anymore. It was like digging up a grave. Like nobody cared anymore.
You're beating a dead horse, my dude.
Exactly. But my favorite of the 70s, aside from Cabaret, of course, and Rocky Horror, Grease 2 was the 80s, so it's fine. My favorite of the 70s was a movie called All That Jazz. I don't know if it is a, do you know the movie All That Jazz?
I've never watched the movie, but I love the musical.
You're thinking of Chicago.
Oh, no.
They are different
What am I
things.
thinking of? What am I thinking of?
Chicago, the song All That Jazz in Chicago. No, but don't worry. It makes sense. It makes sense that you think that. So the music, All That Jazz was created by Bob Fosse, who was the original choreographer of Chicago. Yeah.
That's why it checked out in my brain. That's why it checked out in my brain, because Bob Fosse was just, okay. Yeah, I'm not just tired.
Yeah, and that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. All That Jazz is very fantastical, and it crosses the line between film and theater at times. But really what it's about is Bob Fosse when he was going through addiction.
Oh.
And it's a fictional character who is a Broadway choreographer who's going through addiction and infidelity and has to go in for heart surgery at one point. And when they were like, hey, you might not make it, basically. And you get to see everything sort of becomes a musical number to him. Have you ever seen in a film where a character will be looking at themselves in a mirror and do something like raise their hands and smile, or say something like, it's showtime, or something like that?
I mean, sure.
That's a really common cliche these days from movie musicals, and that's right from All That Jazz. What the main character would do is he would take pills in the morning and then look at himself in the mirror while he's all depressed and just like force himself to smile and go, it's showtime, and go out and pretend to be someone. Yeah. That's
kind of sad.
It's very sad. That movie is very sad, but I love it so much. But that little clip is to me, best taken and borrowed in one of my favorite movie musicals of all time, Rocket Man.
Rocket Man.
So we'll get to Rocket Man in 2 seconds. Basically what happens is nobody cares about movie musicals anymore. They're not doing well. They're being poorly executed, poorly cast, poorly whatever. Nobody cares. So they stopped making movie musicals throughout the 80s. There's a couple, but nobody really cares. There's Grease 2, and that's it. And then
all that matters.
That's all that matters. And then in sweeps Disney with The Little Mermaid. And I could go into great depths about how Disney not only saved musicals, but saved Broadway. But we're just going to quickly, basically what it did was it went, remember this wholesome, beautiful thing that happened? I know you're all really, really sad right now because there's war and the AIDS epidemic. Let's forget about that for a second and let's go back in time with nostalgia to when we were all kids, or what we would watch with our parents when we were kids. And Disney went, a movie musical, and completely reinvented this idea and brought it to a completely new generation. So if we didn't have The Little Mermaid, we wouldn't have had Chicago, which won the Oscar in 2002, which would lead to the resurgence of live action movie musicals. I would also argue too that it was partially Moulin Rouge, which paved the way for these new innovative original musicals and paid great homage to the greats. It was the first musical film hit in a long time in 2001, which again wouldn't have happened without The Little Mermaid. And then after Chicago and Moulin Rouge, it all fell apart again because all the movies were bad. You had DeLuv, you had Phantom, you had Rent, you had the producers. They were all terrible. people were like, oh, you like this again. Oh my God, money, go. You know, and it was bad. But we're really lucky right now to live in a generation of resurgence in the quality of movie musicals. Most of them are adaptations, like Nine. I think it kind of began with Nine. If you've ever seen the Nine film adaptation, it's very, very good. Then you had the plucky Hairspray, and you had Sweeney Todd, the film, which added depth to the already very deep and stunning show. You had Mamma Mia, bringing in a whole new group of theater fans. You had Disney doing their thing. You had Dreamgirls winning Oscars. You had Les Mis making headlines for trying new things that didn't always work, but trying them. You had La La Land winning awards and making headlines. And some do really, really well, like those ones. Some don't, like Cats or The Prom. But basically what film is doing right now is copying exactly what theater is doing, which is rehashing the old. Taking stories that have already existed, taking mediums that have already existed, and rehashing them through bringing these Broadway shows to the screen, Into the Woods, for example, but also using jukebox. What?
It just hit me. I'm learning so much. I love this episode. This is
so much fun. So in the 90s, jukebox musicals started to take off, but weren't really a massive thing until the early to mid 2000s. And then suddenly it was happening on film a lot. You had Walk the Line, you had all these other ones. And then it all kind of like got a little quiet for a little bit. And then suddenly Queen was like, we're doing a film. It's called Bohemian Rhapsody. It's going to be about Freddie. And everyone went, I'll watch that. I watched that. I cried.
I haven't watched it yet.
I cried. It's not great if you like really know the history of the band, but like it's fine. It's fun. But I firmly believe out of all of these jukebox adaptation movie musicals, the greatest of all time is Rocket Man. And I could go into so much depth about this, but basically Rocket Man pays so much homage to the musicals that came before it, more so than just creating a film. It pays homage, it expands upon, and it brings fans and audiences into a story that we either didn't know everything about, didn't know it all, and does it with class and with grace and with spectacle. It goes Andrew Lloyd Webber, it brings in Stephen Sondheim, it brings in Rodgers and Hammerstein, it brings in Cole Porter, it brings in Bob Fosse, it does it all, and it does it about one of the greatest musical icons of all time. And that's why I love Rocket Man. Thank you so much. Those are my notes.
That's actually it.
That's it. And ladies and gentlemen, and non-binaries, those are movie musicals. In an hour. The history of movie musicals.
Musicals with Aurora. I didn't think that would be like the ending of it.
Where was I going to go after that? Oh, here's where I'll go. In the Heights, coming soon.
In the Heights, coming soon. I'm actually excited for In the Heights.
I'm very excited for In the Heights. It looks so good.
Mostly Anthony Ramos.
Yes.
That's what I'm excited for.
And Chris Jackson is in it, and Lin-Manuel Miranda is in it. I'm not super looking forward to the new West Side Story. I love Rachel Zegler, so I can't wait to see what she does. And I love Ariana DeBose, who's playing Anita. But I'm not really feeling the Tony. But Brian Darcy James is in it, so like you can't go wrong there.
Isn't Ben Cook in it? Ben Cook in it, or was he in the?
Ben Cook was Riff on Broadway.
I think he was Riff on Broadway,
yeah,
but I thought he was
he's
also
in the ensemble.
In the movie.
He's in the ensemble of the movie. Mm-hmm. When you're a jet all the way. So yeah, that's movie musicals. I grew up on the old MGM musicals, so like this is just again exactly what it's supposed to be. It is nostalgia for me. I could do without the racism. I could do without the abuse of the system. I could do without the sexism. I could do without the patriotism.
Yeah, that would be nice.
And the capitalism. But the nostalgia, that's what I'm here for. That's what I love.
I think it's also something I'm going to point out. My theater history teacher from college will be happy to say this, but kind of linking movie musicals to what you said in the beginning, like I can't fucking speak English, capitalism and sex. If you notice a lot of the musicals, there's like a sexual tension undertone. Cole Porter, sex sells. He knew that sex sells, And I think Hollywood kind of picked up on that, and then they still use that today.
Yeah. And it's also, I think it's also very important to note that Cole Porter was very gay.
Oh, flaming homosexual.
There are quite a few songs he wrote that were gay sex innuendos.
Anything Goes. I'm the bottom, you're the top.
Yep.
Is there an Anything Goes movie? Because
yeah, there is. It's not a faithful adaptation, but it starred Ethel Merman and Donald O'Connor.
They should remake that because I would definitely watch that.
Yeah, they should. They should remake it without the racism.
Without the racism.
My goal in life is to become popular enough that I can start the resurgence of the classic movie musical. I can remake all the classics, and people will be like, here's the thing about remaking those classic musicals, and it's the problem with revivals as well on Broadway. I'm sorry, we're still talking. Is that a lot of those shows are based in racism and misogyny. So reviving them is basically reviving misogyny and racism. So we don't want that. And you can cast them as diversely as you want, but the themes are still there, you know?
Yeah.
There are a lot of shows that are having like rewritten books, which is great. Like for a while there, Harvey Fierstein was being hired to rewrite everything, which was great because, you know, you would get more updated stories that were less racist.
Racist with an H.
That's my big problem with like the Music Man revival. Aside from the fact that like they're putting all this money into the Music Man starring Hugh Jackman, is that the show itself? The show itself is like it's so old-fashioned that you can smell it, you know?
Yeah.
Like if you're going to produce a show like that, you need to update it. And I don't know if they are. I don't think they are.
I hope so. Listen, you get hired for a job, you do it.
Yeah.
Like in acting world, if you get hired for something, you're likely going to do it unless it's like totally like not in your comfort zone. Like if somebody hired me now to do Maria in West Side Story, I would say no. There's no way. Put me in the ensemble.
Anyway, that's the stuff. That's one of my favorite topics.
Wow, that went in so many directions. I was not expecting that.
Movie musicals have had such an influence on our culture as a whole and have been so influenced by history. It's so fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm. The more you know.
If you ever want to fall down a rabbit hole, I can send you many, many links to old classic performances.
Fun fact, Aurora fell down a cult rabbit hole this past week.
I did fall down a cult rabbit hole, and I also fell down a Bailey Sarian rabbit hole.
Isn't she awesome?
She's great. All of my recommendations on YouTube right now are her videos.
Like makeup and true crime. It's like my two loves just fusing together, you know?
It's fantastic.
Shout out to Bailey. This episode is actually sponsored by Bailey Sari. I'm kidding, it's not, but it should be. Bailey, call me.
Call me. This will be our commercial break in the middle. I guess that's it. We talked for a long time.
Yeah, that's it.
Thanks for listening to my rant. I hope you learned a little something.
Songs on here.
As always, we're just trying out here. I'm trying not to produce racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, capitalistic, patriotistic works. What are you trying to do this week?
Live.
I live. And that's it. We will see you guys next week.
See y'all next week.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Outro music.